The main problem to be solved is to change Russia's calculations. And the way to do that is to have a sustainable policy of military support that convince Russia that it cannot win and cannot achieve its objectives on the ground.
The policy hasn't succeeded so far. And if I understand your prescription correctly, it sounds like you want to continue doing the same thing because it will succeed in a few years. And is that, for the American people, are we giving them a satisfactory policy outcome here? Today, I'm joined by Tom Wright, former Senior Director for Strategic Planning on President Biden's National Security Council. Tom's now a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, just next door to us here at the Carnegie Endowment. We're discussing a country that's remained at the center of global attention, Ukraine, which was brutally invaded by Russia in 2022 and has been at war since then. President Trump is pushing for a negotiated end to the war, but so far those efforts haven't borne fruit. Russia continues its attacks on Ukraine and its civilian population, and Trump has claimed that his patience is wearing thin. So what does this tell us about U.S. strategy on Ukraine? What does it tell us about American power in the 2020s? What options remain, and what might come next? Tom, thrilled to have you here with us today on Pivotal States. I should say that I've admired your work as a strategic thinker here in Washington, and I mean that very genuinely, in a town where a lot of people are often consumed with operational details, even tactical details. Your ability to look longer term and think about the big picture really stands out. So I'm glad to have you here with me.
Thanks, Chris. It's very kind, and it's great to be here.
I thought it'd be interesting if we started by talking about your time in the Biden White House. Obviously, there were a lot of people involved on the Ukraine issue, a lot of different voices, but you were one of the important ones. You were on the National Security Council. You have deep expertise on Europe, and someone who was one of the people who had the ear of the people who were making the most important decisions on Ukraine. So would you go back a little bit and talk about how you saw Biden's strategy towards Ukraine, what the objectives were, and how it sort of evolved over the time that you were there?
This is the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Mm-hmm. I think it is always imbued with great risk and dangers, both in terms of Russia winning the war, but also just in a day-to-day sort of basis. You know, at various points, we came close to pretty significant sort of crises. You know, and of course, it pits a country that's being invaded is smaller than the country that is the invader, and that I think creates some, you know, challenges as well in terms of end states. And then it's a war that also basically went global, I think, in ways that people didn't fully anticipate. I mean, I think if you had said in February of 2022, you know, that in the course of the war, North Korean troops will be fighting, you know, in Russia against Ukraine and sending, you know, 5 million rounds of artillery, and Iran would be sending drones, and we would also have South Korea sending massive amounts of artillery, albeit indirectly, to Ukraine, and Japan, you know, being involved in some way in Australia. I mean, this is a war, I think, that is to the 21st century in a way what the Spanish Civil War maybe was in the 1930s. Obviously very, very, you know, different conflicts, but they both sort of attracted and pulled in indirectly countries sort of all over the world, actually, in different ways.
It was a war that began as a conflict between, well, really Ukraine and Russia, but over the time that you were in the Biden administration, it globalized.
Yeah.
Both in terms of the support that was going to Russia, and you mentioned North Korea, Iran, also China, obviously, and maybe we should talk a little bit about that. But also globalized in the sense that the United States tried to bring a global set of partners on board with sanctions and direct military and other forms of aid to Ukraine. What did you think the objectives of the United States ought to be when you were there, at least in the early months that you went into the White House?
Let me answer that in two ways and just say the objectives the president set down, but then also over the course of the conflict, what I thought are, you know, end state or goal actually was, right? So, I mean, President Biden laid down pretty early sort of three objectives. One was to help Ukraine defend itself against the Russian invasion. Second was to avoid a direct conflict between Russia and the United States.
And there's an obvious, just to say, there's an obvious tension between those two things, which is part of the art of...
And the third was to keep allies united. And there's a tension actually between all those three things. And I think they're all actually pretty important, right? And I think... some people might have said at the beginning he was erring by taking direct intervention off the table or U.S. troops off the table. But I actually think that was incredibly important because I think we also had to keep the American people and Congress on board throughout the conflict as well, because that was integral to our strategy of indirect support. I would say over the course of the war, our objective was to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position on the battlefield so that it would be able to negotiate with Russia to have a Ukraine that was free, independent, and sovereign with the ability to defend itself and to deter a future attack. For the war to actually end, you need to convince the Russians to stop fighting. To do that, you need to convince them that A, they're not going to be able to accomplish their objectives in Ukraine, that there's no hope of being able to achieve those objectives, and B, that they're paying a very high price that will weaken Russia, not just vis-a-vis Ukraine, but also regionally and globally.
I mean, it's interesting because I think on the outside, it didn't seem that the intended end state of the Biden administration was a negotiation. President Biden did say that at least once, and there were hints that that was the case, but the impression that some of us had was that negotiations were off the table because our Ukrainian partner simply would not accept them. But you're telling me that actually there was a lot more openness to it, or is it more that it evolved over time and openness to negotiations as an end state, or at least the next phase of the conflict, grew over the course of your time in the White House?
My memory of it is that we always knew that ultimately there would have to be a negotiation to end the war. But we also knew that that negotiation would reflect, the battlefield reality. Mm-hmm. And up until mid-2023, I think there was a reasonable expectation that, Ukraine could liberate, at least the territory that Russia had occupied in the 2022 invasion, right? If not back to 2014 to the annexation of Crimea. And that, if that was the battlefield reality, that would be a very different type of negotiation with Russia than if Russia was occupying, 18 or 20% of Ukraine, which I think is where it's at today.
So Ukraine winning back some of its territory could also be congruent with the aim of a negotiation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for sure. So it's like, and the terms of the negotiation are obviously, vitally important. And that's where I think there would have been some differences with Ukraine, throughout, because I think, for them, obviously they wanted all of their territory back, which I think is a very reasonable, goal consistent with the UN Charter, obviously. Yeah.
Goal, yeah.
So I think for us, the military piece was key. Like, how do we make sure that Ukraine, has the weapons and the training and the intelligence cooperation it needs in a sustained way to be able to defeat Russian forces in Ukraine. And I would say, looking to where we're at now, if you had told us in February 2022, that basically 3.5 years later, the Russians would have lost over 1 million casualties, well over 1 million at this point, that they would basically be stuck still in the Donbass and parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson with about between 18 and 20%, of Ukraine, including, what they took in 2014, and that they will be making very, very slow gains at an enormous ongoing cost. I think that would have sounded reasonably, I wouldn't say good, but I think people would have thought, that's not a good outcome for Russia, right? And actually Ukraine is still standing and still there. And that wasn't automatic. I think that required a huge amount of work, primarily by Ukraine, obviously, but I think international support helped them, be in a position to be able to do that.
Can you talk a little bit about the tools of American power? I mean, you said that the military dimension was especially important, so maybe it would be good if you just talked about that a little bit more. But first, talk about the other dimensions of power. Obviously, sanctions. We had global opinion. How did you think about the way in which the U.S. arrayed its tools of national power against this challenge?
I think if you look at the sanctions regime, it's definitely not a silver bullet. You know, it's not something that, and when I hear President Trump say, you know, if we just did the energy sanctions, then the war would be over. I think that's a consistent fallacy, not just in this war, but often throughout conflict historically, where, you know, it's sort of viewed almost as an economic thing that if the other side is losing money because of its fighting, then it will make a rational decision and stop. But that's obviously not
That
the
rarely
full.
happens. I mean,
Yeah, that's not the full picture because, you know, there are other objectives.
But then the question is, why do you think that military force is going to be more effective? I mean, we have a really recalcitrant regime in the Kremlin here, as you just explained eloquently, not that susceptible to economic pressure, capable of finding ways around the pressure that we've put on it. Militarily, why is that going to be any different?
I think it's totally different because with military power, you're physically stopping the other side from achieving its objectives. So you're not trying to, you know, deter or compel Putin by, like, psychologically by saying, you know, we're going to do this, therefore you have to back down. You're just proving, like, on the battlefield that he is physically not able to take what he wants to take. And so when he is trying, even over the last sort of 14 months, right, after Ukraine took Kursk and then the Russians went in the offensive because the Ukrainians are sort of spread thin, right? In that time, like, he is physically not being able to fully take Pokrovsk or other areas that it was assumed he would be able to take. And so it's just creating a battlefield reality that demonstrates to him and to Moscow that they can't accomplish their objectives. And then Ukraine, with a mixture of long-range strikes and other capabilities, are inflicting ongoing costs on Russia. So I think it is different. I do think the sanctions help. Like, I don't want to say they're not helpful. I think they are important. Can talk about that because they suppress Russia's ability to reconstitute itself.
Maybe just briefly talk a little bit about global public opinion and how you viewed that.
I think at the start, the assumption was that, you know, the world would be sort of pretty united against Russia. You know, and I think it did become more complicated. The global South obviously was calling for an end to the war and condemning the invasion. You know, we had Gaza, which made things more complicated. I think we got accused of hypocrisy after that, obviously, in parts of the world. But our approach, I do remember in the first sort of move by global South countries on peace plans, we sort of talked about what our attitude should be, and we decided not to sort of oppose what they were doing. Like, we did not say that they should not be involved or that they should not be looking for peace. We decided to constructively engage, right? And we met pretty much all the countries, including China, Brazil, South Africa, and others. And our message was always the same. It was, you know, we welcome your involvement. If this is a very complicated war, if you're going to try to help bring peace, that's great. We welcome that, but you need to do your work. You can't just sort of make some declaration. You have to really invest in the problem and try to figure out a way forward. And if you talk to Vladimir Putin, you also need to talk to Zelensky. And if you go to Moscow, you also need to go to Kyiv. And you need to grapple with the problems and the dilemmas on territory and other things. And over the course of the war, I think we were able to, you know, stay engaged with those countries. I think we also needed to show that we had a peace plan too. And that's where Ukraine ended up coming in with its own sort of peace initiative, which I think was helpful. But I think it was a struggle. You know, I think we had to, you know, I think it wasn't just a matter of saying Russia bad, Russia invaded, everyone should isolate Russia and be on Ukraine's side. I mean, that might have been okay at the start. But I think once we were, you know, 12 months in, like, I think we needed to, you know, engage those countries that weren't aligned. And I do think we did that, actually.
So the question I think that arises here is, did the objections of these rising powers, you mentioned Brazil, South Africa was obviously important. Did their objections ever give you pause about the policy that the Biden administration was pursuing? Did you ever say, I wonder if they have a point?
On what, though?
On negotiation in particular.
There was really only one moment, I think, where there was any inclination from the Russians that they might be remotely interested in negotiation, right? And that was on the very eve of the counteroffensive in 2023, where we had some sense that they didn't know if it was going to work or not, right?
Interesting.
And it was never serious. Like, they never reached out to say they wanted to talk, but there was some sort of sense that maybe, there was elements in Moscow that might have, thought this might be the time to try to at least slow down the counteroffensive, right? Otherwise, there was never sort of a moment where there was any reason to think that the Russians were interested. On a number of occasions, well, at least on 2 occasions, senior officials were talking to their Russian counterparts and basically said, we keep hearing that you want to talk. Like, if you have something you want to say to us, say it. And the very clear answer back was absolutely nothing to say. So I think that there really wasn't moment, especially in 2024, for the first part of 2024, we didn't have a supplemental. So we weren't in a position of strength at all. And the Russians knew that. And we were focused on trying to get this up. And then after that, the Russians are just waiting for the election, And I think that in the context of this year, we know, Trump gave the Russians a proposal that was much more tilted toward them than anything we would have given. And they said no, because they still want Ukraine. The bottom line is, and I think the incontrovertible sort of truth is that Russian intentions, throughout this war have remained very, very consistent, what they were at the beginning, which is Vladimir Putin wants to break Ukraine and take it, and he's willing to pay an enormous price to do that. He still feels he's in a position to do that, and that is not sort of changing. And, he's been offered now a freezing of the lines. He's been offered no NATO. He's been basically offered an end to U.S. support for Ukraine after the war. All of these were, demands that we believed he had that would have gone too far for us. Some of them, like an end to U.S. support for Ukraine, for example. But none of that is enough. He actually wants to take, to take Ukraine. And that is, and he wants demilitarization. He wants territory he doesn't control. And that's even too much for the Trump administration. So I think that's the problem. The problem we have is how do we convince Vladimir Putin to, negotiate and to basically change his opposition to something like a free and independent sovereign Ukraine that he's currently opposed to. That's our diplomatic problem. We should be spending time trying to figure out how to do that diplomatically, militarily, and in other ways to create those conditions for negotiations to succeed. And that was our focus really in 2024. It wasn't that we were sitting around saying, we don't believe in negotiations. We always believed negotiations, the moment for them will be in 2025. We were preparing for a 25 negotiation. When Biden was running, when Harris was running, when we thought we might, if one of them won, our assumption was that this would be the year of negotiation. Because if one of them had won, then, Putin would have to grapple with the fact that the war will go on for 4 more years, or he could have a negotiated settlement. I remember saying to, at the time that if we did everything right, and if we had support in place, and we had a framework for negotiations, and we had the Ukrainians on board, and the Russians weren't making any gains, that even then, our chances of success in the negotiations was probably about 30%. Putin remains Putin, right? And he remains fairly ambitious in this conflict. And this is very deeply ideological for him. It's rooted in Russian nationalism, his belief in Russia's place in Europe. And that's a very hard thing to shift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I want to come back to that problem because for me, it poses the core dilemma from a U.S. policy perspective is just how important the stakes seem to be to Russia's current regime under Vladimir Putin. But before we go there, let's talk a little bit about Trump. So we've talked about Biden. You have a generally positive assessment of what you managed to accomplish there. You were moving towards negotiations if you had had a second term. Trump then, of course, wins the U.S. election, also has a plan for negotiations. How did you assess his plan off the bat, and then how do you see it having unfolded over the course of the last 9 months?
Yeah, I mean, when they won, I think, when Trump won, when his team, won, they had a theory of the case, which I don't think was ridiculous, right? I do think it was wrong, but I don't think it was absurd, right? And their theory of the case was, if you freeze the lines and say no NATO, then we'll bring the war to an end. The Russians will take that because they're getting a lot. The Ukrainians might not take that, but we can bludgeon them into accepting it. Mm-hmm. And in any event, the Ukrainians aren't going to get back their territory. So all we're doing is speeding up the tape, right? Because otherwise the war will go on another 3 or 4 years. Lots more people would die. We'd end up in the same position anyway. So let's just skip to the end, impose this deal. And then they wanted to obviously normalization with Russia, relations with Russia and do all of that stuff, right? But the basic theory of the case, which was something we got accused of not doing, was like be realistic, freeze the lines and no NATO, and then the war will be over.
Just by no NATO, you mean Ukraine does not get to become a member of full-fledged member of the NATO alliance?
Exactly, right. And we believed very strongly that was not going to work. And we told them, privately that, our assessment was that it wouldn't be enough for Putin. And that we believed Putin's objectives went much, much further. If you want the war to end quickly, you have to convince Putin that the war could go on for a long time unless he compromises. And so it's important to have sustained support. But, obviously they didn't agree with us.
This was your message to the incoming Trump administration?
Yeah, this was, I think they wanted to try that. They did try that. They really put pressure on the Ukrainians to obviously a very extreme degree, as we saw in the Oval Office meeting. The Ukrainians then tacked back and I think compromised on their objectives and then endorsed a unconditional ceasefire, which I think was incredibly important for them to do because it sort of flipped the script with Trump, right? Because initially they were saying we won't agree to a ceasefire, unless there's security guarantees and all of this stuff they would say to us.
Yes, right, yeah.
And after the Oval meeting, they changed because they knew the U.S. might totally pull out.
Right.
And I think by May, Trump sort of realized that the Russians were mainly the problem, right? That they were the primary obstacle to peace.
He sort of locked himself in by saying he was going to, resolve this in 24 hours and then in 100 days, and then he still hasn't. So he sort of invested his own political capital in it.
I don't really hit him for that too much, because I think that was...
I'm just saying it makes it more difficult for him to pull back.
I think that's sort of hyperbole in his part, which of course is very normal for him. And I think it's a very complicated situation, right? I think it's a very difficult situation. I think they've been slow to figure a lot of this out. I think when I hear them say we've done more for peace in Ukraine than anyone ever, I find that sort of hard to believe because I actually think in some ways they're further behind than they were when they started.
How do you mean?
Because it took them a very long time to figure out the actual problem, which is Putin's objectives. That the main problem, Ukraine was sometimes difficult on end states, but not nearly as difficult as the Russians. And the main problem to be solved is to change Russia's calculations. And the way to do that is to have a sustainable policy of military support that convince Russia that it cannot win and cannot achieve its objectives on the ground, and that is that is the necessary precondition for anything to work diplomatically, and they still I think are flailing around about how to do that. They've gotten some of the way with the arms sales, but it's still fairly limited. It's a little hard to tell because they haven't really been public about what they're sending. But the best we can tell is probably about 60% of what was sent in a similar time period last year through the arms sales, with the exception around interceptors, the air defense bit, where we don't know if stuff is being sort of sent yet. But
so just to try to understand your view of what Trump has done, you agree that trying to seek a negotiated settlement is the right thing to be doing. You agree, I imagine, that some pressure on Kyiv was necessary, although I'm sure you don't like the way that they went about doing it, nor do I, for that matter. You think that the sanctions that they are threatening but have not yet implemented are a good idea, but not the solution. And your main criticism of their approach would be that they have not done enough to make a long-term commitment to the military support of Ukraine.
I do probably quibble a little bit, but I don't know if they're that important. Like the sanctions, I don't think the Graham-Blumenthal bill or what Trump has proposed in the China bid or the India bid is a sensible way to go about it, And I also think that in terms of Europe stopping buying oil from Russia, the only countries that buy crude oil from Russia are Slovakia and Hungary, right? And so I think a lot of this is a pretext for Trump not to really do anything. And, I think in terms of pressure on Ukraine, I definitely don't like how it was done. I think, there was a need to bring them along. I think them getting to support for an unconditional ceasefire was good. It was sort of ugly about how that transition happened. Mm-hmm. I do think that I've always thought, I think we always thought there needed to be a negotiation. Like we were planning toward negotiation. I think 25 was always going to be the moment where a negotiation might be possible. My worry now is that the basic precondition for a negotiation to succeed is not actually in place, which is to say to Putin, you can't achieve our objectives, and if you keep going, we'll keep supporting Ukraine as long as you're attacking it, and that's not going to change.
I want to look forward from where we are now and think about, what's the solution to this problem. You wrote a recent article in The Atlantic that was entitled "The Only Plausible Path to End the War in Ukraine." And the key sentence for me in this article is when you write, "The only plausible way to end the war is to create a battlefield reality that convinces Putin that he cannot make more gains, that he will pay a massive price for continuing the war, and that this reality is unlikely to change." Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we need to do to get to a negotiated settlement. I think there's a separate question about what that outcome in a negotiated settlement looks like. But just on this bit, I think it means, that Russia is unable to make territorial gains more than a sliver, right? Which I think is sort of where we've been actually for a while. But the gains would be very modest, if at all. That there will be very little prospect of a breakthrough, that they would be taking very high casualties and paying a high price, that Ukraine would be holding Russian assets, strategic assets at risk, and maybe economic assets at risk as well, that would convince the Kremlin that this, if it continued for another 3 or 4 years, would be very damaging to Russia, and that there was no real expectation on the Russian side that, that the bottom was going to fall out of Western support for Ukraine, that will continue in place, that the US and Europe will continue to support Ukraine indefinitely if needed, and that creates the leverage in a negotiation to say, it's in all sides' interest to bring this to a conclusion. If you don't have that, if you have all of the first parts, but then the U.S. suggests that maybe in 6 months it will completely cut off Ukraine, then why wouldn't Moscow just wait 6 months? If there's really massive shortages in certain types of critical weapons, then why would they not just wait to see if those supplies run out?
It's clear that could encourage Russia to continue its war. But I guess the reverse is where I'm struggling a little bit. I mean, you said earlier in our conversation that we have to be realistic about Russian objectives here.
Yeah.
So isn't there a significant chance that going back to large amounts of U.S. military aid to Ukraine would just put us back where we were 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years ago and turn this into an indefinite long war? How much confidence do you have that taking the course of action, the strategy that you would like to see with more military support to Ukraine, if I understand it correctly, would result in negotiation on any time horizon that makes sense from a policy perspective?
But if
you have to, I would think you would admit that there's a chance that it would fail and that we could just end up in a forever war.
I think this is an important point. I mean, I think there is definitely a chance that negotiations could fail, even if everything is set up as I recommend, right? There's no guarantee, that Russia will accept an independent, sovereign Ukraine, even if they get to keep the territory in a de facto way that they currently occupy. I can't guarantee that Putin will decide that he wants to compromise. I would make 2 points, though. One point is that from the perspective of the United States, I think this war is sustainable. I don't think it is a forever war in the context of, U.S. troops dying, obviously, on the battlefield in Ukraine. We are not sort of bogged down there. The cost, I think, was very manageable before Trump came in, and now the U.S. is basically not spending anything, on the war. So I don't really understand why it is inherently, unsustainable in some way, right? I think it might be unsustainable for Russia, but it's not sort of unsustainable for the United States. The second point is that from a Ukrainian point of view...
Let me just start with your first point, because this is an important one to me. Okay, so first of all, there have been significant costs, and I completely agree with you. It would be wrong to analogize the war in Iraq to what we've done for Ukraine. First of all, we invaded Iraq, so major difference right there. Second of all, as you point out, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we were losing a lot of American servicemen and women, and that's a really important difference in terms of the cost. That said, we have invested a significant amount in Ukraine. $187 billion have been appropriated for Ukraine. We spent almost $100 billion along the way. And it's hard for me to imagine that if this were to continue for several more years, that those costs would not rise. I mean, obviously, this is also creating escalation risks with Russia in Europe itself, as we've seen over the course of the last few weeks in Poland, in the Baltic states. And I blame Russia for those things, but it's also a reality that we have to accept that as long as this war goes on, the European security situation is just going to be less stable. And I think you actually agree with that. You just want to get to an end in a way that I'm challenging a little bit right now. So the problem is not so much that the costs are too high. I do think they're high, but it's just from a basic policy perspective. The policy hasn't succeeded so far, and if I understand your prescription correctly, it sounds like you want to continue doing the same thing because it will succeed in a few years. And is that for the American people? Are we giving them a satisfactory policy outcome here? I mean, how is that satisfactory?
I guess I think I disagree with all parts of what you said.
Okay, please explain. That's what I want to get to.
To start with, I think the alternative. Firstly, I do not agree that the policy has not worked. Right? I think Russia is bogged down in Ukraine. They've taken a massive number of casualties. They're unable to accomplish their objectives. They're basically still trying to take the Donbass, which I think, they do have small bits of other parts of other oblasts as well, but they're still very much sort of bogged down. I think between 18 and 20% of Ukraine is what they occupy. And Ukraine remains sovereign and it remains free. And, I think that is a good outcome, right? I think, again, as I said, I think if you said that in early 2022, that will be where we are 3.5 years in, I don't think people would have thought that was a Russian victory, right? So I don't agree that it hasn't worked. I do agree, obviously, that Ukraine has not sort of won this war, right, and that we are not on the cusp of a diplomatic settlement. But the alternative to what I'm proposing is not sort of a peaceful end to the war. The alternative to what I'm proposing, I believe, is a Russian victory in the war, or for the war to continue for a long time under much worse conditions for Ukraine and much better conditions for Russia. And to me, that's being realistic. That is actually the choice. And that's not a choice that I favor, right? That's what Putin wants. That's the choice he is posing to us. And so we can choose whether or not to continue to stand up to him in a way that I do believe is very sustainable for us, and to weaken Russia in the process and to make it more difficult for them, not just to make gains in Ukraine, but also to threaten other countries, or we can pull back. And I would argue that all of the risks you identify on escalation and other things all get worse if we pull back and Russia is in the ascendancy. I think that if you look at the air incursions over the last month, I believe that is a direct result of the fact that there's ambiguity in Washington about how the U.S. will respond to that. So Russia's probing and is testing.
I don't disagree with that. Actually, I grant you that. Yeah.
So I see the escalation risks as rising if we pull back from it, and I don't really understand how. I think one could decide. The Trump administration, I would totally disagree with it, but they could decide we don't want anything to do with this. It's not in our interests if Europe is at war or the war gets bigger or NATO is attacked. That's a coherent position. It's one I fundamentally disagree with, obviously. I don't understand that even on a coherence basis, the idea that this is unsustainable for us, that we can't do it because otherwise something really egregious will happen here. That doesn't.
I understand. I understand what you're saying, but it's not. I mean, does that mean then that you would accept supporting Ukraine indefinitely with military, diplomatic, financial resources?
Well,
just to
honestly,
prevent
yeah. I mean, I think it means that. Well, you got to remember what I believe is that the way to bring it to an end faster is to commit to support Ukraine as long as Russia is attacking it, right? I also think that support should be, indirect as it has been. I think we should be helping Ukraine, defend itself, which we have been. I do think that is sustainable, and I don't think we should change that position as long as Russia is attacking. I do believe we also need a parallel track on negotiations. I think we need to create dilemmas for the Russians diplomatically. I think there's lots of things we could be doing, including this week, to make things more complicated for them diplomatically up at the UN or elsewhere. And so I think there needs to be a very robust diplomatic part to this too. So I'm not just saying we just accept that this will go on forever. I think we should be working very hard to end it. But I do think that we should not be sort of pulling the plug on Ukraine because Russia remains sort of the obstacle to peace. I don't see how that helps not just Ukraine or Europe, but us. I don't get what we get out of that.
So what are some of the things that you would do then that you would, what are some of the measures that you would pursue right now in order to avoid this going on indefinitely?
Well, I mean, I think if you just on a small tactical level this week, the UN General Assembly, I don't see why, the United States wouldn't host a peace conference at the UN and call for an unconditional ceasefire in Ukraine and basically ask all of the global South countries and China to agree to an unconditional ceasefire. Now, I think China would oppose it, but I think it would be hard for them. It would make them pretty uncomfortable.
Right, yep.
I think many countries in the global South would support it. the Russians would hate it, but they wouldn't quite know how to respond. They would say it's all about, we need to create their whatever phrase they use about addressing, from their point of view, the root causes of the conflict. But I think that would be one way of, now that we have this movement from Ukraine, I think we could really push that advantage.
Makes a lot of sense.
That's not going to end the war,
no, but
right? But I think it helps. I think on the negotiation, I think the point we need to make to the Russians is, look, like, you guys have created what Putin warned about at the beginning, which is an enemy on your border that's highly militarized and very embittered because of what you've done to it. That didn't exist in February 2022, but that type of Ukraine, an enemy of Russia is there now, and you don't have a solution to that other than like breaking it as a state. We're not going to let that happen. So we should have a conversation about, like, how do we get to an end state where, when the war ends, from your point of view and our point of view and Ukraine's point of view, it is as stable as possible. And that gets into work we did on end states, where, to me, I think there's two different models, right? There's like the Israel model, where basically we help Ukraine, but it's fighting on its own. And that model, creates a country that I think is highly insecure, quite militarily effective, and willing to take risks and preemption
highly
and other
insecure.
things.
Why?
Insecure because they see a very large threat on their border. They don't have an external guarantee of another country to help it.
Because just so we're clear, we're talking in this scenario, in the Israel model, Ukraine has a large military because we and the Europeans have invested in building up its own self-defense against future Russian invasion.
It's on its own against Russia, basically, with our support. And the other model is some type of security guarantee, where they are either in NATO or some other mechanism. And my point to the Russians would be that that actually, from their point of view, they probably have more of an interest in Ukraine being part of an external structure that it's somewhat restrained, and other countries have sort of a significant say over its foreign policy and its defense, than one where, basically Ukraine is on its own. Now, I don't expect, the Russians to accept that, but I think over time, I think that is a dilemma they would need to confront, and I think we can create that dilemma a little bit.
So just to go back to in the two versions that, and obviously there may be variants, but in the two versions that you're proposing, an Israel model, is the other version then membership in NATO? When you say with security guarantees?
I think there's different ways to do it.
Okay, I'm just trying to clarify.
Yeah, I mean, the model of NATO I like for Ukraine is a combination of the West Germany model and Norway. And West Germany, that model it only applies to territory that you control, right? So not territory, not like East Germany, or in Ukraine's case, not occupied Ukraine. That I think is fairly clear. The Norway model, Norway joined NATO at the beginning, but it agreed to limits on NATO troops inside of Norway, basically no NATO troops inside of Norway, and no very limited NATO use of ports, of Norwegian ports, and basically was Norway inside of NATO, but no NATO inside of Norway. And I think that's something that if we were to end up with Ukraine getting into NATO, Norway would be a basis for that, plus maybe some negotiation on architecture, around it. Now, again, I think that would be like a lot for the Russians to accept. Ukraine as its own deterrent, right? So Ukraine build up the Ukrainian military, so they will be able to defend themselves and to deter a future attack. And that I think is
without security guarantees.
Without security guarantees, that's the outcome
So this is more of a negotiating strategy that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I do think over the long term, I think NATO membership on the Norway model is probably the best outcome for European security, and I think that would produce the best guarantee of a stable sort of peace. I think that is not possible, obviously, if Russia doesn't agree to it, because Russia can just choose to continue the war. And so in the absence of that, I think would support, indirect support for Ukraine, so they are able to defend and to deter. And that means creating a force of the future inside of Ukraine, that has an air force, has a layered air defense, has a means of defending itself, and I think has a long-range strike capability that it could use if the war broke out again, that would be effectively the deterrent to Russia attacking.
In this scenario that you're talking about, is Ukraine effectively neutral?
I don't know what neutral means. I think if neutral means not a member of an alliance, yes, Israel is not a member of a formal alliance with an Article 5 guarantee, but I don't think anyone would say it's neutral, like it's an ally basically of the United States. So I don't really know what neutrality means. I've looked at all the models. We did a lot of work on all the models of neutrality. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of them work for Ukraine because the main question with neutrality is what is the enforcement mechanism? Like what happens if neutrality is breached? And, in this case, if Ukraine is attacked again, my argument would be that Ukraine would have a strong enough military itself with continued indirect support from us, maybe along the lines of what we've done over the last 3 years, or maybe amped up a bit with maybe no restrictions on the use of weapons systems, for example, that will be enough. But the Russians wouldn't consider that neutral. Ukraine would be in close partnership with us. So I think, if it makes people feel good to call that neutrality,
but it would be a lot easier for the Russians to accept Ukrainian neutrality where Ukraine buys its weapons from wherever it wants, including the United States and Europe, than to accept the Ukrainian membership in NATO.
I think they're adamantly opposed to both, right? I think the Russian position in June of this year now, previously, at June, when I mean the Istanbul negotiations, when they presented the memo, they do not want a militarized Ukraine that has external support from other countries. They don't want that at all because they realize for Putin, that's as big a problem as NATO membership. So they're opposed to both, right?
But if that's true, what you're saying, and I actually think it probably is, aren't we stuck? That's what I'm getting at. Then we're in a situation where there's no end in sight.
I think we're a long way off the end, yeah. But I guess where I push back on you is you seem to be suggesting we're stuck, therefore we ought to change and maybe not help them as much. Whereas I'm saying, we're sort of stuck, but we need to find a way of changing the Russian calculations because the alternative is much, much worse. I feel like you're not really grappling with, the alternative. You're sort of saying, this isn't really working. I dispute that, but okay. It's not working in the sense that, Russia's not about to be forced out of Ukraine, right? Therefore, we're sort of stuck and we need to have the courage to be able to change our position. But I would just press you, what does changing our position mean? Changing our position means embracing an alternative future that is demonstrably worse on almost every level for Europe, Ukraine, and the United States than where we are right now. I guess I don't know if you agree with the nub of our disagreement, but I think that's how I sort of would interpret it.
I think the point that I'm making is that I feel that we're rubbing up against the limits of American power. That America is very powerful. It's been able to support Ukraine, a much smaller country, in a major war against a much larger nuclear-armed nation, but it hasn't been strong enough to bring about any of the long-term strategic end states that we have aimed at. And that is problematic for me. And I wonder whether or not somehow, and I'll be honest, I don't necessarily have the solution to this, but I wonder whether or not somehow we ought to be changing our expectations of what the United States is actually capable of accomplishing in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, you see, I do have a very different view of that. As I look at it, this demonstrates not the limits, but in some ways the potential of American power, right? We were able to support a much smaller country than Russia and help it basically defend itself against a fully fledged sort of onslaught by the Russians, a country with nuclear weapons that at a certain point it was willing to contemplate using, with support from China, North Korea, and Iran. And we were able to create a situation where 3.5 years in, Ukraine is still there. they have like 80%-ish of their country, and they're inflicting massive casualties on Russian forces, and Russia's basically stuck, and we're doing that at a very, very small financial price and military price, with no U.S. troops on the ground, no U.S. casualties, and to me, I mean, maybe it's glass half full. But I'm not saying we should be satisfied with that. Like I said, I mean, I think we should be pushing for a negotiated outcome. But I don't know why we at this point would sort of throw up our hands and say, that has failed, and we ought to. I'm not saying you're saying abandon Ukraine, but basically undertake certain actions that would significantly hurt Ukraine. I don't know why we would do that, especially when they are willing to negotiate. They want an unconditional ceasefire right now, So they're not the reason why this war is continuing.
Tom, thank you so much. I really respect your point of view on this one, and
likewise,
have learned a lot talking to you about this in recent months and years. In fact, I hope we can continue to talk about it. Perhaps a year from now, we'll come back and things will look either the same or different. And we can reflect on our conversation today. So thanks so much.
At least I haven't said the war will end in the next few months. And you can come
no
back
predictions.
And quote it to
It's
me.
dangerous for your career. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for listening to Pivotal States, where we explore U.S. relationships with key nations around the world and discuss what these relationships reveal about American power in the mid-21st century. Today, I've been talking to Tom Wright about the dilemma the U.S. faces with Ukraine. Getting even a decent settlement for Ukraine is to make a costly commitment for several years to come. But is it worth it? Make sure to subscribe and join us next time as we take a close look at evolving relations between the United States and India with Ashley Tellis, my colleague here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.